Now, I've been speaking about this in gendered terms as if this largely only applies to women, and it's not true. There are standards of beauty for men today. They are less rigid than they are for women, largely just because women themselves are less homogeneous in terms of what they say the ideal man should look like, except for height. There's at least in the United States, there's still a very strong height preference. But build and that type of thing isn't quite as standardized as it is for women. But there are standards for men today, and we are seeing increasing numbers of eating disorders in men, increasing numbers of what we call muscle dysmorphia, which is the sense that your muscles, you need to be bigger and stronger and build more muscles. And the concept I want you to relate with muscle dysmorphia is called the Adonis complex. Is the idea that men feel like there is this perfect muscular body out there, that they just need to keep working towards, that is an ideal goal, and they work towards that by counting their macros and lifting heavy and spending just unbelievable amounts of time in the gym. Now, admittedly, the discrepancy that we see, so we do know that there are these standards for men. We do know it impacts them. We know that they do care about those standards to some extent. Most survey data suggests they care less than women. Although, I'm always very quick to admit that what we also might be tapping into is that men might be less open about body insecurities than women. And that's just because of, we encourage men to be less open about everything. That's part of the hegemonic masculine ideal, right? To be the strong, silent, tough, keep your problems to yourself type. So, there probably are some gaps in the data in regard to this topic. But moving beyond how individual men might be responding to the to standards of beauty and fitness related to them, just on a larger societal structural level, the beauty myth contributes to male dominance. Because it channels women's energies towards the pursuit of beauty. It might subtly encourage men to care about their appearance, but it overtly encourages women to care about their appearance and to be evaluated in regards to their appearance. It creates the space where it is expected that women will be evaluated in regards to their appearance in ways that men aren't. Just think about how the looks of women in industries and occupations that really have nothing to do with their looks, like athletics and politics, how often their looks will come up. Right. It's one thing to talk about the looks of an actress because you would be like, okay, well, that's relevant and pertinent. But how often people kind of debate the attractiveness of, their teachers, female politicians, the people on the news anchors. It's much more so for women than for men. I mean, so this does take an emotional toll on women who fail to achieve ideal beauty. And so I don't think it's just a matter of not having good data. I do think because the messaging in society is much more directed towards women and more overt, that the average woman does probably feel worse about her looks than the average man does, because society has been set up in such a way to make that so. And whether that's her face, her age, her body, that sense of dissatisfaction. And so, this is problematic because, of course, it diminishes, women's self-worth and self-esteem. It might lead them to be unfairly discriminated and against in some settings. It might lead to people being biased and in their evaluations of them, in regards to something like beauty that should have nothing to do with their with their performance at work or at school. And as we've already noted, the rigidity of the ideal is made worse by the fact that achieving that ideal is just impossible for so many women. Their race, their ethnicity, their class, their sexual orientation, whether or not they have a physical disability, all of these aspects of women's identity beyond their gender can make the beauty myth, the beauty ideal, harder for them to uphold, in some cases, maybe even impossible for them to uphold. So they're literally being evaluated by an ideal, a standard that they just cannot meet. But still, moving away from beauty, if women are able to do masculinity and they have more behavioral freedom than men, why are they then still considered disadvantaged to men? Because that sounds like a real advantage, right? Being able to do both masculinity and femininity with a certain amount of freedom. Well, that's because of the relations of inequality that the previous chapter addressed. And so if you remember, the three relations of inequality are sexism, angiocentrism, and subordination. And so all three of them pop back up in this chapter in order to help explain why women are still disadvantaged to men compared to men, even though they have that greater behavioral freedom. So the first relation of inequality, sexism, your book just addresses that really simply. Femaleness is always a possible source of prejudice. And they talk about several examples. So they talk about the orchestra example and how, there was the sense that women were being discriminated against in their orchestra assignments. But it wasn't until they switched to blind auditions and then later blind and barefoot auditions that they realized how many people were allowing their perception of gender to influence who they thought deserved to be first chair in the orchestra. The science student example that was discussed in a previous chapter, where they talked about how male and female professors, when given identical resumes of science students, and the only thing that was changed was their sex, how they rated the male students higher in competence, higher ability, and mentoring, ability to be mentored. If you were to read the study, they also recommended higher starting salaries for the male students. And like I said, these weren't real, students. These were identical resumes where the only thing that had been changed was the name. And so by just changing it from a female name to a male name, there were all these increases in perceptions of positive characteristics. Another example of how sexism exists and results in inequality in a modified patriarchy is when you look at professor evaluations. And of course, as a professor, this topic is near and dear to my heart. So I give you the link if you want to check this out for yourself. But basically, when studying professor evaluations, they noticed that a lot of the language that students use to describe and evaluate their professors appeared to have a real gender dynamic. So just a few trends to note. First of all, in terms of physical appearance, while both men and women were discussed as being hot, women were much more likely to be discussed in terms of ugliness. So just going back to that beauty standard, and this is what I was talking about, how when women fail to uphold that, the social repercussions can be a lot higher than men failing to uphold that. So students were much more likely to note their female professors' lack of attractiveness than they were their male professors. Disorganization. So, if you have a professor that, had a disorganized desk or, wasn't very neat or, wrote sloppy, all of those were things that students were more likely to note negatively for women more so than men. And then in terms of emotional labor, the politics of being nice. A nice male professor resulted in a huge bump in terms of positive evaluation. but women were most likely to be negatively evaluated if they weren't sufficiently nice. And although being nice did make them a little bit more higher rated than their female counterparts who weren't, it wasn't the same level of bump that male professors received. And so in addition to this, I show you the charts for how, just in terms of genius, men were more likely to be rated as genius. Men were more likely to be rated as described as brilliant and cool. As you can see, hot was a little bit of a mixed bag, and as well as funny. And they said that clearly some of this seemed to just be a gendered aspect of subjectively, who students just associate with those terms, right? That if we look at some of those terms, cool, funny, genius, if we look at those terms through gender binary glasses, who do we associate those terms with? We don't associate them with femininity in women. So then the second relation of inequality, this was Angiocentrism, and we've already kind of talked about this. So we'll return to our discussion about how femininity is disparaged relative to masculinity. So the feminine apologetic requires women to perform to a certain degree a devalued identity. If you can't risk being overly masculine and you have to do femininity to a degree, but femininity is largely devalued in a lot of context in society, basically you're being required to sign on to your own devaluation, right? Whether that's pretending to be not as smart as you are, whether it's having to pretend to be nicer than you are so you don't get negative evaluations from students, whether it means, having to be flirty or having to focus on, looking a certain way, even if it has nothing to do with your job description or your day-to-day activities. All of that is a requirement of the feminine apologetic. And so, as your book notes, because power is gendered, the requirement to do femininity is also the requirement to do the powerlessness, passivity, deference, submission, fragility, and weakness, right? If you don't do any of those things in any context, think about the names that society, particularly men in society, but also probably some women as well, think about the names that they would call you if you were always bold and overt and blatant and blunt and strong and dominant and aggressive. All those traits that sound so good in men, when in women and not offset by any feminine traits, usually there isn't the same societal admiration. Instead, there becomes some societal pushback. And so this all relates to the concept of doing gender, right? That you are actively having to do some aspects of the gender role and gender expression and be strategic about it, because you're trying to maximize societal reward and diminish the amount of societal punishment that would be headed your way. And so just an example of how even commercials meant to be uplifting for young women, young girls, how they can kind of fall in this androcentrism trap. The first one is for a company called Goldie Blocks. And they had a whole series of commercials, what they said, pushing back against the princess machine. But the thing about the commercials, especially their original commercial, was it established this dichotomy between the princess girls and the Goldilocks girls, who were seen as being less feminine, but cooler, smarter, because they were into engineering and building things. And the princess girls were just seen as jumping around dressed in their princess dresses. So kind of by setting up that comparison, they're kind of shitting on the princess girls, excuse my language. And Angiocentrism is behind that. The idea that one is better than the other, as opposed to just saying, in a perfect world, we should have space where there can be both types of girls, or girls can be either or. Much cooler commercial, I think, would have been the princess girls also doing some of the cool engineering, robotic, Goldilocks activities while dressed in their princess dresses, right? That's a very different message. Similar, but not quite as bad as the Verizon commercial, what she hears when you call her pretty. This really speaks to a false dichotomy that young girls can hear growing up, that you're pretty or you're smart. And pretty is associated with, femininity, dresses and dolls, and caring about your appearance, and not wanting to get dirty, and superficial things. And smart, of course, is smart, interested in deeper things, and being academically curious, and so forth. It's kind of that same false dichotomy as, being a princess girl versus a Goldilocks girl. Why can't you be pretty and smart? Why do we set it up like it's one or the other? And then in this contemporary society, because this certainly wouldn't have always been the case, but in this contemporary society, when you set up that dichotomy, you're pretty or smart, you're a Goldilocks girl or you're a princess girl. These commercials make it sound like the obvious choice is to be the Goldilocks girl, or to emphasize that someone is smart. But in reality, of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, because women are required to do that balance. And those beauty standards do exist. And so, no matter how smart you are, you can't necessarily escape the possible social consequences of ignoring contemporary beauty standards. And really, that is why there is no hegemonic femininity like there is hegemonic masculinity. There isn't just one ideal way of being a woman that everyone would want to be. For one thing, as your book notes, it's because unlike the hegemonic man, who even women are supposed to look up to and aspire to, or aspire to some of his traits, that isn't the case for women, because men aren't supposed to look up to women and aspire to their feminine traits. So there is no hegemonic femininity, because women are not put out there as the ideal person. Feminine traits aren't put out as being the ideal traits in society. But then even amongst women themselves, there's no dominant kind of version of femininity right now, because women are striking their own individuated balances of masculine and feminine traits, trying to uphold that modern Barbie rule. And so this brings us to the last relation of inequality, which is subordination. And so the requirement to do femininity is also the requirement to do subordination. Subordination is about never bothering others with one's own discomfort or concerns. And your book gives the examples of the popularity of Botox to erase RBF, resting bitch face, because you don't even want people to think that you're walking around being unpleasant and unhappy, as well as the example of giving birth like a girl, which means, I guess, keeping in mind that there are other people in the hallway that are sharing walls with you, and trying, not to be loud and unpleasant so as to not bother them. To do femininity is to do deference, and to do deference is to do femininity. Deference is, if you think about those gender binary glasses, deference is a feminine trait. And so your book notes how, the original voices, before they started allowing, you to have multiple options, but the original voices of assisted technology, like Siri as well as Alexa, those were feminine voices, right? Because assistant technology, what is the purpose of it? It's there to help. And who in life is meant to be there to help? It's women. And so, what does this look like? This doing deference. Your book mentions it's, being touched, being the person that, someone touches your back when they say, excuse me, or they grab your arm to say, oh, squeezing through, right? Because when you are the subordinate in these power relations, your dominant person does not have to worry about respecting your space to the same extent as they would with another dominant person. Not initiating or holding sustained eye contact, smiling, hedging, which is a verbal thing, right? Instead of stating what you think outright, you might say things like, I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but I don't know if this is the answer. I'm not sure if this is right, but all of those are verbal hedges, and women are as well as people who are subordinate in situations are more likely to engage in that behavior. Hyper politeness, lots of excuse me's, I'm sorry's, and then questions in response to questions. So your textbook notes that these behaviors are exhibited by people in subordinate positions relative to others. And the reason why so many women exhibit these behaviors is because of their general subordinate position in society. So you'll see men exhibiting these behaviors when they are in established subordinate positions, whether it's being the kid that gets picked on in school, or low man of the totem pole in your fraternity or organization, or later maybe even in your office or job or construction site. But for a lot of women, because their societal position is subordinate, these are behaviors that they subconsciously do. Like they don't even think about it, too much anymore. If you're a woman, maybe consider, how often you do some of those things, or how often some of these things are done to you. People touching you without your permission, like in public spaces, people not getting out of your way off the sidewalk. How often do you hedge or exhibit hyper politeness? I'm sorry, excuse me, whatever in your verbal communication. What happens if you go around all day without smiling, and if you start being aware of those types of behaviors, I know that for myself, when I became more aware of those types of behaviors, I noticed that I engaged in them a lot more frequently than I thought. And so we have this conclusion. Women then have more freedom than men to do gender as they like. They can do both masculinity and femininity. There is a carrot and a stick, however, a benevolent and hostile sexism. Both doing and not doing femininity can be dangerous. All right, so this part of our chapter introduces us to these additional new concepts, benevolent and hostile sexism, and how they both work in conjunction with one another to make women do femininity to some extent, even if they are not so naturally inclined to do so.